Rewind Reviews. Since this channel began in 2022, the content and opinions have varied for each film reviewed, and sometimes these opinions can go against the general consensus. Are these reviews just an excuse for attention? Or are they just about one person expressing his love for what he is passionate about? Either way, it is an historical fact. Sharing opinions has never been the internet's defining attribute. Hello guys and welcome to another Rewind review. In this video we're going to be travelling back to the year 2003 to take a look at X-Men 2. When anti-mutant Colonel William Stryker kidnaps Professor X and attacks his school, the X-Men must ally with their arch-enemy Magneto to stop him. Bryan Singer returns as both director and co-writer, alongside Zach Penn and screenwriters Michael Dougherty, Dan Harris and David Hayter. X2 X-Men United, a title which I have never really understood to be honest, stars the returning cast of Patrick Stewart, Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen, Halle Berry, Famke Janssen, James Marsden, Anna Paquin, Rebecca Romaine, Shawn Ashmore and Bruce Davison, alongside newcomers Alan Cumming, Brian Cox, Aaron Stanford and Kelly Hu. This is one of those movies that I do very distinctly remember being very excited about when it was first announced, when I started seeing all the trailers for it. I was quite young when this franchise started, so I didn't get to see these movies in the cinema, but I was a big fan of the TV series by this point, the animated series, so I was really familiar with the characters. The movie was absolutely everywhere, they were advertising it on every single channel. It was so exciting waiting for this movie to be released. I mean, I still remember the day that my dad brought the DVD home with him, pulled it out of his bag, and just my excitement just went up so much, like I can finally watch this. I will fully admit that by that time I'd actually seen about the first 40 minutes or so, because I actually attended a little after school club in my primary school days, and one of the things that we used to do is we used to like split up and do like different activities. You could do like arts or sports or something. This particular afternoon I thought like, oh, I'll go and do the film club or the PlayStation room or something like that, and they said, oh, we're going to be putting on X-Men today, and I thought, oh cool, really loved the first movie, okay, I want to see that. And then they started playing it and they realised, wait, this doesn't look like the first movie, and then it suddenly clicked, oh, this is the second one. And as far as I'm aware, my dad still doesn't know about that, so shh. But the excitement was there from not only myself, but a lot of fans who absolutely loved the first movie and everything that we were seeing about the new one. It definitely looked like they were going to be expanding on the world a little bit more, and we were going to explore so many more mutants. The first movie wasn't perfect by any means, but I do think that it is a really good introduction to these characters, to this world, and it really laid the groundwork and the foundations for this series to grow. And with X-Men 2 being the first sequel in this entire franchise, there was a lot of pressure on this movie to really build off what the first movie did, and boy does it. This is not a good movie, this is a fantastic movie that really set the benchmark for what not only Marvel Comics adaptations were doing at the time, but for superheroes in general. And revisiting it 20 years later, does it still hold up? I absolutely still think it does. So let's take a look at it. The story this time around sees the tension brewing up between mutants and humanity after the President of the US is attacked by a teleporter called Nightcrawler. And this starts off a mystery surrounding what happened and who it was who orchestrated it, with characters like Magneto being a prime suspect. And while the X-Men pair off and try to find Nightcrawler, Wolverine continues his search for answers surrounding his memories and his adamantium skeleton. Now, one thing that I do like about this is that while it does sound separate from the main plot, it isn't. In fact, Wolverine's story really does play a really big factor into the overall plot, with his origins having deep connections to the masterminds behind the attack. Both of these stories are interesting enough on their own, and I will admit it is quite clever keeping Wolverine's part of this feel a little bit unconnected, as he wasn't originally part of the X-Men, but over the course of this movie he becomes an important member and really starts to view them as a family, going out of his way to protect them multiple times. And seeing him being put in that position is a really interesting idea, because he's such a character who's so isolated and alone from all the others that it's really fun getting to see him actually having to not only stay with them but look after them as well, even going so far as to pretend to be a teacher. And as for the other characters, the story very smartly breaks the teams up into a few small groups who all have something to do, because we have Jean and Storm attempting to find Nightcrawler while the Professor and Cyclops pay their old friend Magneto a visit. I've got to be honest, saying this all out loud, it really does kind of drive this home just how dark this movie actually is, because it is a really dark story overall. Well, it's not exactly as dark as something like like Logan or the New Mutants for instance, but it is much darker than the first movie, with a new character introduced called William Stryker, who orchestrates an invasion on Xavier's mansion while the team are away to kidnap the students, and has plans to not only experiment on them but wipe out mutant kind altogether. Stryker is a really good character, he's a really good antagonist for this movie. In this movie he's played by Brian Cox, the other one, and what he brings with not only his performance but the way that the writing is for his character, it does feel very human and very believable. In some instances he does have a few similarities to Magneto, or at least what the direction that they went with Magneto in the first movie. He has experienced the horrors that mutants can inflict on him firsthand, but that trauma is amplified because the mutant that inflicts those horrors upon him and his wife is his own son. So like Magneto, his motivations are completely understandable, but you do not condone what it is that he's doing, because he is basically trying to completely erase mutants from planet Earth. But the thing that separates him from Magneto is that Stryker is a little bit more sadistic, because where Magneto was all about mutant superiority, Stryker is more about trying to actually experiment with them and turn mutants into weapons. And we see firsthand of how it is that he's able to do it and what sort of techniques he uses, and it is genuinely quite nasty, and there are definitely some really nasty moments in this one, because not only does this movie actually delve into Wolverine's origins and you see how it is that he got the adamantium skeleton and the claws, but you also see what Stryker is willing to do to his own son. That is why this movie is so dark, but it is really good. The performance from Brian Cox is absolutely amazing, and I think that Stryker is definitely one of the best villains in the X-Men movies. This movie, like the first one, is very character driven, with the characters making all the decisions that impact the story. And like all the other X-Men movies, this is very much an ensemble movie featuring a wide array of characters, most of which are returning from the previous movie, and a lot of them are actually brand new characters that we're meeting for the very first time. Returning characters like Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman, Professor X, played by Patrick Stewart, and Ian McKellen returning as Magneto. I mean, they are perfect cast, and they are some of the best casting choices that Marvel have ever made, and the performances that they give in this movie really do kind of delve into those characters a little bit more. I'll be honest, I don't really know what else to really say about these characters or the performances, because they are these characters and they have absolutely nailed them so well over the years that honestly you cannot think of these characters without these performances. I will say, when it comes to Wolverine, I really do like that they chose this movie to explore his origin story, because this is a very big important part of his character, and I feel like that is a really big key part in why it is that he changes his perspective from being quite isolated into having to work with the X-Men and seeing them more as a family, because we are seeing a much more vulnerable side to him that we've never really seen before, as well as just the full-on berserker field animal that we know he can be. And my God, it is so satisfying when he kicks off in this one. And when it comes to Magneto, it is very tricky bringing back an old villain into a sequel, especially when you already have a villain who is going to take up the entire antagonist spot. And what they do with him in this movie is they do follow the path that Blade 2 established with a few of the sequels, where he has to team up with the X-Men because the enemy of his enemies is his friends. But it does feel very in character, and it does fit this story and the narrative that they are trying to tell, because it is very much within Magneto's character because of what's been established previously in the first movie. We understand his motivation and how he views things. So seeing him getting involved in this story and actively helping to defend not only the X-Men but mutant kind from this big human threat makes so much sense, and it really does add another layer to this film. And on top of that, he just gets to be absolutely awesome in this movie. Like, the stuff that he gets up to with his powers this time around, especially when he's got those three metallic balls hovering around him, he is an absolute badass in this movie. And then we have characters like Storm, played by Halle Berry, and Mystique, played by Rebecca Romijn, who have much bigger roles to play this time around, to the point where we actually do get a few sequences that do kind of show them kind of in their environment doing what it is that they do. Because like with Storm, she is basically a god, and they don't really sort of delve into that too much when it comes to the movies. They don't really sort of show off her power set that much. We only get a glimpse of it in the first movie, so I really do like how we can actually see just how powerful she is, with the fact that she basically takes on several jets on her own. I also feel like the performance from Halle Berry is just a little bit better in this movie, because they actually get the chance to really sort of explore Storm just a little bit more. She is a really interesting character in the comics, and I just don't think that they've really done enough with her in the movies, but I do appreciate they do give her a little bit more to do in this one, and I do like that they do expand it further in The Last Stand, but I really would like to see a bit more from Storm in the future. I always thought Mystique was a pretty cool character, so it's actually really cool getting to see her not only come back into this this, but actually seeing her being able to use her abilities to infiltrate these government facilities with so much ease. She is just an expert assassin. I really love the direction that they have gone with her in these films. They don't really do much with her in terms of characterization because she isn't really the focus of these movies, and I do like that in First Class and Days of Future Past they really do delve into that a lot more, but I do like what it is that they do with her in this movie, because this is what I feel like her character is in the comics. I mean, they gloss over a lot of things, especially with one of the characters that is introduced in this movie, and I'll talk about him in a little bit, but I really do love the character in these movies, and I think Rebecca Romijn is a really great choice for Mystique. Jean Grey is a much bigger character in this movie. Famke Janssen returns once again to play her, and I think that the performance this time around I do think is a little bit better, because this time around they are starting to kind of explore a little bit more of her character, and we kind of get to see a little bit of her evolution from the first film. The breadcrumbs were there for what it is that she will ultimately become in The Last Stand, and I do like how that is continued on into this one, and do establish that as much as they can, and they do reference that, because that is one of the few plot points that is built up over the course of the 3 movies, and it is actually paid off. Maybe not necessarily as satisfying as it really should have been, but I do think that it is a payoff, and I do think that is something that they could have done a little bit more with these films. Because like case in point, one of the things that they do actually bring up a lot throughout the first 2 movies is this potential mutant registration act that will get introduced, and it just never actually gets paid off. Like what it is that they do in the 3rd movie is they introduce a cure, and then not only that, they're introducing the Phoenix Saga, so it does feel a little bit of a departure from what it was that these first 2 movies were building up. Obviously the eventual war between humanity and mutants is definitely something that they do need to establish, and that is brought into The Last Stand. But I feel like rather than going in the cure direction that movie does, I feel like having it be the registration, which is the thing that they do establish is potentially being considered in the first movie and this one. I do feel like that is a really good idea for this franchise to have gone in, but ultimately it does get wasted. Trying to juggle so many characters in these franchises is a really hard task, especially when there's just so many characters that you need to not only bring back but introduce, and unfortunately one character that does get the short straw is Cyclops, played by James Marsden. He is a really good actor, he is really charismatic, he is very naturally funny, but I just don't think that they gave him really anything to do in these movies outside of just being angry with Logan. I think that they really could have done a lot more with his character, and it is really disappointing that they take him off the board as early as possible, and he's actually barely on screen in this one. They do try and establish his relationship with Jean as much as they can early on in this movie, but because he is barely in this movie, they can't really give it that focus, so that when the bigger emotional stuff kicks off, you're not really that invested in what happens. He is meant to be the leader of the X-Men, and I know this from the comics and the animated series, but if it was purely based on these movies, I just wouldn't get that feel from him at all. So while the performance is good in this movie, I just don't think that he's given anywhere near enough to do. But one thing I do like a little bit in this movie is that some of the more minor characters like Iceman and Pyro are actually brought back into this movie, and they're given a slightly more larger role this time. They don't have a huge part to play in the overall narrative, but I do like what it is that their characters bring to this movie. Because when it comes to Iceman, there's actually one thing that they do with his character in this movie that I actually think is actually quite a clever idea, and that's that they introduce his family. He goes and talks to his family and he tells them that he's a mutant. And the whole scene kind of plays out almost like a coming out moment, and I think that how it's played, how it's acted, how the entire thing is staged, I do think it is a really good moment, and I do like how it is integrated into the story. It grounds it, it makes it more believable. Like, these are very larger than life characters with very over the top abilities, but I do like these more character moments because that is what these movies are about, the characters. And I like how this is actually contrasted a lot with Pyro, because you don't really have an idea of what his backstory is. Like, it's a complete mystery. You never really find out what it is that happened to him and his family. But there are a few moments in here and a few little hints that maybe something bad did happen, because he does talk about just how dangerous he is. He is a guy who uses fire, who controls fire, so maybe something happened there. I'm not really too familiar with the character from the comics. I only really know him from the films and the animated show, but I do get the impression that something very bad happened because of his abilities, which does tie into the overall narrative and all the stuff going on with Stryker. So I do like those little hints that potentially do establish that that's what happened to his family and why it is that he ended up at the academy. And then when it comes to Rogue is one of my absolute favourite characters within the X-Men comics, and I think Anna Paquin, I do think that she is a really good actress. I just don't think they have really given her enough to do in these movies, but I do think in this one they do start pushing her in a slightly more different direction. I actually like this direction that they are going with her. She's a little bit more confident in this movie, she's a little bit more at ease with her own powers, and I do think that the direction that they were going with her character in this one, I do think is an interesting idea, because Rogue, in pretty much every interpretation of the comics, the animated shows, the games, she is a very powerful character, and I do wonder if that is the direction that they were going with her, because she's a much more powerful character in this movie, to the point where she's able to actually use her powers to actually help people, because there's a sequence where Pyro just goes insane, he starts blowing up cop cars and all sorts, and she uses her powers to not only stop him but put all the fire out that he's caused. So there is a bit of me that does wonder, was the original idea for The Last Stand going to involve her having a much bigger part to play in the overall story, and maybe being the one who takes down the Phoenix? I've no idea about this, this is pure speculation, but I do think that is a really good idea for the direction that they go with her character, because she was the main character of the first movie. She is the character that we are introduced to first. She is our eyes into this world, and I feel like having her being the character who does have a more central role across the trilogy is a really good idea. So I do think she is a little bit better in this movie, but I just don't think that what they do with her in The Last Stand is really the direction that they really should have gone with her. Now, I said that there was a lot of new characters that are introduced into this movie, and one of the prime characters that is introduced, one of my absolute favourites, is Nightcrawler, played by Alan Cumming. How Nightcrawler is brought to life in this movie is genuinely incredible. This is one of the best depictions of a comic book character, and that really says a lot considering just how many perfect casting choices that these movies have made across their entire series. And even though he doesn't wear the more traditional red and black suit that he wears in the comics and the animated shows, I do think that the way that they've gone with his design, his overall costume, his look, it's really good. I really love how they have brought this character to life. This is a perfect adaptation of a character, because they do seem to understand what makes him who he is. They really do delve into what makes him and who he is. They don't establish his backstory that much, because as I said, there is definitely a few things that they do kind of skim over in this movie. They do establish that he was part of the circus, they do mention that, but they don't actually go into the reason why it is that he was brought up in the circus, because a very big part of his backstory, one of the things that they don't mention in the movies whatsoever, so if you've only seen movies you are not aware of this whatsoever, Nightcrawler is the son of Mystique. I've never understood why it is that they never actually address that whatsoever in these movies. There are hints surrounding it in First Class, but that's it. There's no other hints whatsoever. And it is a really big part of not only Nightcrawler's story, but Mystique's as well, because she does have a connection to not only Nightcrawler, but Rogue as well, and they just don't even do any of that. It makes sense within regards to the story that they're trying to tell in this movie, because that's not what it is that they are trying to tell. And I feel like if Mystique was a much more prominent character in these movies, they would have done that, but what it is that they are trying to do in this movie, it makes sense that they don't establish it within this film, but there's no reason why they couldn't have done it in the future sometime. But outside that, he is genuinely an incredible character. He's one of my favourite characters in this movie. He's one of my favourite X-Men characters. I'll talk about it a little bit more later on, but I've got to be honest, he has one of the best action sequences in this entire series. And one thing I will say about Nightcrawler is that he does actually get a few little funny moments in this movie, and that's actually something that I really do like about this movie. I think that this is a lot funnier than the first movie, and the comedy is actually genuinely really funny. It really does hone in on the characters. As I said, very character driven story, and I like how it is that they have handled that, because the comedy does come from the characters. The chemistry between them is really good. The actors, the performance, everything about it, they really are good together. I do think the chemistry works very well, and that's why the comedy does land very well, because you do know these characters now, you know how it is that they work and bounce off each other, so it does make those little moments of banter quite funny, and how they use their powers as well. Because one of my favourite scenes is when Wolverine meets up with Iceman in the kitchen, and he's looking around for a beer, and he's like, no, this is a school, why would we have that here? So Wolverine goes and finds a soda, and before he's about to drink it, he just hands it to Iceman, who blows into it, turns it all icy, and then hands it back to him. It's just little things like that. It's just really good little moments between characters that really sort of helps ground this and make it a bit more human and a bit more realistic. I really do love those little moments, because it really does make this so much more of an experience. I would have liked a little bit more banter between Wolverine and Cyclops, because they do have a really good rivalry, but I just don't think they've really done enough of it within these movies. I do like their scenes together because they are funny. It is still a serious movie, and it does still have a lot of very dark, very serious moments like the first movie did, but I do think that it is lightened up a little bit more from the comedy. It is definitely needed, and I really do appreciate how it is integrated into the story very naturally. And then when it comes to Lady Deathstrike, who's only got a really minor role in this movie, it's enough to have a bit more of an impact. I do think she is an interesting character. I do think that she does have a really good backstory. I do think that, especially with the way that it is connected to the Wolverine story and how it sort of folds into the adamantium creation, there is a lot of potential for how it is that she could have fit into this movie, but I don't think that they really do enough with her. In this movie, all she really is just sexy henchwoman who's being controlled by Stryker, and that's really it. They don't really do much with her outside of just being like a bodyguard. I mean, she does get some really good scenes, like the fight between her and Wolverine is incredible, but I do think that they could have gone a different direction with her character because she is really good. And I do think Kelly Hu is a really good actress, and I do think that she could have been given a little bit more to do. But again, like Nightcrawler, there are definitely a lot of things that they do need to skim over in order to focus on the story that it is that they are trying to tell in this one. So I do understand the direction that they go with her character in this one, but as a fan of the comics, as a fan of the character, I do think that there is definitely a lot more that they could have done with her, maybe not in this movie but in the future. But she is really cool in this. I do like the look, I do like how it is that they do establish her talons. Like, it's not exactly as it is in the comics, or the way that it is literally just her fingers. Like, it is like a proper adamantium skeleton this time around, which does make sense. It does fit within the story, within the context that they are trying to establish in these movies, and as I said, it does lead to one of the best action sequences in this movie, so I can't really complain. Now, seeing as though I am talking about a lot of the characters in this movie, one of the things that I do want to very briefly mention is the cameos. This movie features a ton of Easter eggs and references to other X-Men characters who don't really have much of a role to play within this movie, but they may show up in The Last Stand, they may show up in some of the future movies, sometimes not at all. But the one thing that I think separates this movie and how the cameos and Easter eggs are handled in this movie from a lot of the future ones is that this knows where to draw the line on how it is that it establishes that these characters exist, how they are integrated into the story, and what it is that they do with them. The way that it's handled in this movie is they are just kind of there in the background, just kind of establish the world a little bit more and just sort of expand the focus out just a bit more. Because even though they are very big, prominent characters in the comic books, people like Kitty Pryde and Colossus do have a little brief appearance in this, and I do like what it is that they do with them and what they do with their powers. There's also a deleted scene that is featured on the DVD release of this that actually shows that Jubilee had a slightly larger role in this movie. It's more just like a little scene all to herself, so you kind of see a little bit of her power set and what it is that she can do, but that's really it. So I do appreciate that she is incorporated in this. I've got to be honest, it is a little bit unfair that Jubilee is like one of the only prominent X-Men characters that has rarely actually had any proper presence on the big screen. They tried establishing her in a little bit more in Apocalypse, but they barely did anything with her. If you're like me and you grew up with the X-Men animated series, then you are aware of who Jubilee is. You know her as a member of the X-Men. I do feel like maybe they could do something like that with her in the future one day. There's actually one really cool scene that involves Mystique when she sneaks into Stryker's lab, and she basically like goes on his computer and goes through all his files, and you see the names of all these different mutants that he has encountered over the years. Now, some of the most prominent ones that are there feature Maximoff, who people will know as Pietro and Wanda, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. And one that kind of surprised me a little bit is actually Remy LeBeau, aka Gambit. He's a character who's only actually had one live action appearance. It wasn't a great appearance by any means, and I kind of forgot that it was even meant to be him, to be honest. But it is genuinely really surprising that this is like one of the first proper times that he has actually been mentioned in these movies, and they've rarely actually done anything with him. He was meant to have his own movie, and I think Channing Tatum was set to play him at one point, and for reasons that movie just never happened, so it's kind of disappointing. But then a little bit later on in the movie we get one scene that's actually a really good introduction to these characters, but when it comes to the continuity and the future of these movies, the continuity of these movies is absolutely awful, and this is one of the first moments where it started to kind of feel a bit like, oh, maybe they don't actually know what it is that they're doing. There's a scene involving Mystique when she goes into a bar and she basically just tries seducing one of the security guards who works with Stryker and is trying to keep Magneto in prison. And on one of the TV screens is a debate going on between what's going on with mutants and humans and how best to deal with mutants. And the people having this debate is Dr. Hank McCoy, who most people will know as Beast, and Dr. Sebastian Shaw, who people have met in the movies from First Class, played by Kevin Bacon. That's all their role is in this movie, just to have this little debate on a TV screen, but it does establish that both these characters do exist within this world, and I do like that little cameo from them. But within regards to the continuity that does go on to be established within the future movies, it doesn't really add up. It's unfair to have a go at this movie for it, because this was only the second movie. It was the next next one that really started to mess things up a little bit, but I do think that what they could have done is really sort of establish that a little bit more and build off of that rather than just completely changing it and being like, oh well, these characters always existed and this happened instead. So it doesn't always feel like these movies have a very fluid continuity, and I do think that is one of the biggest negatives when it comes to this series overall. Despite some of these movies being some of the best superhero movies ever made, that is like the one thing that most people will have a little bit of a nitpick at. But as I said, when it comes to a lot of the cameos, the Easter eggs, references in this movie, it really does work. It does fit within the story. It doesn't just take away from what's going on. It doesn't distract from the story in any way. It works. Another thing that works really well for this movie is the overall look that this film's gone for. This definitely does feel a little bit more cinematic and a lot bigger. I think the budget definitely was upped a lot for this movie, because not only is there a lot more detail on a lot of the sets, the scale is really amped up with a lot more locations this time around, and it isn't just like in these tiny little sets and little areas where they go running around in. This has some really big, huge sets that these characters can operate in, because compare how the finale was in the first movie where it's all set on Liberty Island, it's in just like this little small little museum and the torch. It's not really a very big arena to have this big climactic showdown, but then see just how big Alkali Lake is in X-Men 2 and just have a look at these impressive sets. It really is a much bigger movie and it does feel that way. And I will admit, when it comes to the costumes that are featured in this movie, obviously they're still sticking with the black leather suits that they had in the first movie. It's not the X-Men look that people really want to see, but what I will say is that I do think the costumes look a little bit better in this one. There's a few subtle differences here and there in the overall design. I actually do like that. I like how the colours on the costume kind of stand out just a little bit more. I don't know if it's just me, but I will admit that they look like they're a different material this time around. They look a little bit more flexible and a bit more breathable, like the character can actually move around in them a lot more. Because that was one of my favourite behind the scenes videos of the first movie, where because these costumes are so tight and so restrictive that they can't even jump over a little wall because they just can't move in them. That's why I do think the costumes are a different material this time around, because they do seem a bit more flexible. It really does add to the action sequences a lot more because they are a lot more faster, they are a lot more aggressive. I think that they are handled really well. I do think that the costumes allowing them to do this is a really big help. And then when it comes to a lot of the effects that they're utilising in this movie, this is one of the things that really does help expand this movie a lot more, because they weren't able to do too much with regards to a lot of the powers and a lot of the abilities that these characters have. And what they do in this movie is they do use a lot of effects to really sort of help establish what these characters can do, because it is a really good mix of both practical and state-of-the-art CG effects, because what they are able to do in this movie is they do make these powers look very believable. Like the stuff with Pyro, it's proper flame balls getting thrown at things, but it is done in a way that does make it look like he is controlling it. It does work very well. And even when it comes to like Nightcrawler and his little BAMF effect, I really love how they have brought that to life, because that does look very realistic, and I do think that how it is utilised in a lot of these scenes is really good. But the CG effects this time around are definitely scaled back a little bit more, because the first movie did have quite a few CGI doubles, very noticeable CGI doubles. This time they do seem to make it a bit more of a point of actually trying to do everything as practically as possible, trying to do everything within camera and just using a few little camera tricks here and there to try and make it feel a little bit more realistic. Like a really subtle effect that they always do in these movies is how Mystique is able to shapeshift between forms, and I think that that is a really clever effect. It's very subtle how they do it. It is very much a case of one person walk behind a wall and then have Mystique walk out the rest of it, or a different actor altogether, and just add some sound effects on in the background just to make it sound like she is shape-shifting. It is very subtle, but it does work. I'm sure it takes a lot of pressure off the effects crew in this movie, but there is one scene where they actually do try and do a proper shape-shift effect on Mystique in this movie. It does look really good. I do question just how long it actually took to film that one scene, because this is during that sequence in the bar where Mystique is seducing the security guard, because the woman that he meets at the bar, the really sexy attractive blonde woman, is Rebecca Romaine, who plays Mystique. So she has to be there as her normal self, and then she has to turn into her blue form. I really do want to know just how long that sequence actually took to make, considering just how small a scene it actually is. But it is a really good sequence, and I really do like how it is that they have brought that effect to life. They don't completely ignore completely CGI sequences in this movie, because there are a few of them. I do think that they actually look a lot better than they did in the first movie, especially the sequence involving the Blackbird where it's escaping two fighter jets. I think it's probably the best looking the jet has looked in any of these movies, and I do think think that is a really good sequence, and the way that it shows off not only Storm but Jean's new form powers as well. It is a really great sequence. There are a few moments where I think the CG is just a little bit 50-50, but honestly you barely notice any of those sequences. It will not take you out of those moments at all. And when it comes to the makeup, once again I think it is absolutely brilliant. How they brought to life characters like Mystique and Nightcrawler is really good. They do feel very real. I do like how it is that they do make those characters look, they do feel like they do in the comic books, but they do work very well in this real life setting. I know how long it takes to actually put this makeup on and the dedication that these actors have to go through, and it is genuinely quite strenuous and it is a really long time, but it is really worth it. And now we go on to the section that I've been really looking forward to talking about, and that is the action. The first movie only really had a few little bursts here and there, but it did have a few good action sequences here and there. They weren't brilliant, but I think that they were good at really establishing what it is that the characters can do and their abilities as a team. But this is where it really kicks up a gear. The action sequences in this movie are absolutely fantastic. I've got to be honest, one in particular has yet to be topped. There is a lot more action in this movie. There are definitely a lot of brief bursts like the first movie did, and they are all within the context of the story, so nothing feels like it's just happening just for the sake of having something to liven things up. But they are all expertly handled. They are really well framed, choreographed, everything about them really good. And there's three really big standout sequences for me, and I absolutely love each of these sequences. The first one I want to mention is the invasion of Xavier's mansion, where Wolverine finally gets to go, well, not completely, but he does lean very heavily into his berserker rage, and I really love how that sequence is handled. It's a really good, intense sequence. I love getting to see Wolverine just kind of let off his leash and just going absolutely berserk on all these soldiers. How he's using his abilities to kind of sneak up on people, kind of sense where it is that they're coming from. And one of my absolute favourite bits is when he's fighting off that guy with a knife in the kitchen, and his claws come out, so he throws him into the fridge and he just grabs him, stabs him, and peak Wolverine. The second one I want to mention is the fight between Wolverine and Deathstrike, which is far more violent than the one between Wolverine and Sabretooth in the first movie. It is fantastic, and I love seeing the contrast between the two fighters, because Deathstrike is a lot more agile, a lot more flexible, and she is a lot more dangerous than Sabretooth was, and Wolverine is a lot more of a brawler. So trying to see these two going up against each other, it really is an interesting fight. It is really well choreographed. I love how it's staged. It's just handled beautifully. But then the final sequence that I've got to mention happens right at the beginning, and it is Nightcrawler attacking the White House. This is one of the best opening sequences in any comic book movie. I think Deadpool and Logan are pretty close to this, but I think that what this does to establish the tone that this movie is going for, and really sort of establish just how far this franchise is able to go, it is an expertly handled sequence, because everything from the build up, the setting, how they are able to use Nightcrawler in this sequence, what it is that they're able to do, the little camera trickery here and there to make it look like he's appearing in more places than once. It's really clever. It's one of those sequences where to this day I'm still not 100% sure on how it is that they actually made this scene. I've got an idea about it and I do want to know how it is that they did make this, but part of me doesn't actually want to, because it will kind of take away from the magic of that sequence. It's just so well done. It is absolutely amazing. My favourite shot of that entire sequence is just that panning shot when Nightcrawler's just appearing across the room. He's just taking out all these security guards. Punch, bamf, appears somewhere else. Punch, bamf, appears. It's so good. It is one of the best sequences in not only this movie but the entire X-Men franchise. The only sequence that comes close to this is the Quicksilver sequence from Days of Future Past, and I am definitely split between which sequence I prefer more, because I love both sequences so much, but this one really did establish what you can do in these movies. It is the benchmark for how you can do action sequences in a comic book movie. So as you probably guessed, I kind of like that scene. The action in this movie is absolutely fantastic, and compared to the first movie, this is a big improvement. They really make full use of the characters' abilities, and just the way that some of these sequences are handled is just so good. It really is one of the best movies in the X-Men franchise. And another thing that I think is a big improvement over the first movie is the score, this time by John Ottman. John Ottman is more Bryan Singer's go-to guy when it comes to film scores, and there is a good reason for it, because what John Ottman does with this movie, with this score, is really good. I feel like this is definitely one of the better superhero themes that we have actually gotten over the years, and in terms of the cinematic X-Men outings. This is the X-Men theme. Yes, most people are going to think of the 90s TV series when it comes to whatever the theme of the X-Men is, but in terms of the actual cinematic outings for the X-Men, this is that theme. The soundtrack is such an improvement over the first movie. It is so much more iconic. A lot of the themes that they use throughout this movie are really good. They help enhance a lot of these sequences, and whenever I think of these sequences, I can't think of them without the music. I do think one of the reasons why the music actually fits quite well into this movie is because John Ottman is not only doing the composing for the score, he actually edits these movies, so it does fit very well within what it is that they are trying to do within regards to how things play out. So it does fit very well. They are used very well in each sequence. It does enhance a lot of these scenes, and I do think that it is a brilliant score and soundtrack overall. I don't know if it's my favourite X-Men score of the lot. There are definitely one or two others that I will think of a lot more, but in terms of what it is that it needs to be for this movie, I do think that this is the best score that they probably could have come out with. I really do like the music in this movie, and it is great that they got to bring it back for a lot of the other movies that both Bryan Singer and John Ottman were involved in. Overall, this is an absolutely fantastic movie. It is a huge improvement over the first movie. It expands on everything that we saw from the first film, with a really great story, a really great expansion on the characters, as well as the introduction of a lot of new players as well. The effects, the music, the cinematography, the camera trickery, the overall plot and pacing, the actors and their performances. This is one of the best superhero movies ever made. It set the benchmark for what you could do with not only these films, but the entire superhero genre as well. I absolutely love this movie, and if you are somebody who is interested in Marvel Comics, who is interested in these characters, I not only highly recommend you, I urge you to check this movie out. This is a must-watch movie, although I do admit you do need to see the first movie in order to see and understand this one, but it is still a very, very good, very enjoyable experience all on its own. So with all that being said, my rating for X-Men 2 is a 9 out of 10. I do think this is an absolutely brilliant movie. This is one of my absolute favourites, but I do think there are definitely a few moments where I think that they could have expanded on maybe just like the more emotional side of things a little bit more, just established a few of the relationships just a little bit more, but outside of that I've got real no complaints about it. So that is pretty much it for what I want to say for this video. So if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you are enjoying this content, please like, subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you have seen X-Men 2, let me know down in the comments what you think about it and where would you rank it in terms of the X-Men franchise. We know mutants and the X-Men are going to be established in the MCU very soon. I do want to see what it is that you guys think about what it is that they could potentially do. So what are your ideas for what it is that they should do with the mutants in the future? Also, if you have any ideas for any future Rewind reviews you would like me to do, let me know down below. If you haven't had a chance to check out my review for the first X-Men movie, the link to that is going to be down in the description, so feel free to check that out if you want. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next Rewind review. See you guys.